Hey everyone, welcome to our Final Four preview show. As always, I'm Dan.
And I'm Joe.
All right, Joe, this has been the wackiest NCAA tournament I've ever seen. And I thought to start it off, we need to talk about the second time ever 16 seed beating a one. And Joe, can I say that I was not super shocked by this one? I mean, a 16 seed beating a one, of course, it only happened one time ever with with Baltimore. Was it University of Maryland, Baltimore
Or
County? Yeah,
County.
yeah, UMBC beating Virginia the year before Virginia ultimately won the national championship. And this year it was Fairleigh Dickinson taking down Purdue. And Joe, I think both of us had Purdue going out in the second round. So we thought that Purdue was a very vulnerable one seed, but I definitely didn't think they were a one seed that was vulnerable of losing to a 16.
Yeah, Dan, for me, this topped Virginia UNBC for a couple of reasons. One, the one thing I think that not enough people say in defense of Virginia for that loss 5 years ago was that DeAndre Hunter, one of their best players, he was hurt and didn't get to play. And so I
Mm-hmm.
always felt like that hurt them significantly in that game. But this game, Purdue was riding high, winning the Big Ten tournament. Zach Edey was looking like a national player of the year, front runner, and had dominated the Big Ten tournament. And then they just inexplicably lose this game. And the way they lose it, their best player, I don't even think he attempted a shot in the last 8 minutes. I mean, how does that happen with drawing up the plays?
Well, and especially how does it happen considering that Zach Edey's 7'4" and you're playing a 16 seed? I mean, this is a no brainer that you need to feed him the ball just constantly.
And that was always, I think, one of our concerns about this team was they were so front court oriented with Edey. Their guard play was questionable. I never would have dreamed it would have been exposed in this round, though. I mean, credit to Fairleigh Dickinson for pulling it off, but to me, it was more about just another huge missed opportunity for Purdue. I think I've been on record on the show in past years with the argument that I feel like all the programs that have been unable to make it to a Final Four in the last like 15 years, I feel like Purdue is the one that just most frequently seems to come up short.
Yeah, they do. I mean, and it's when you give them all the expectations. I remember a couple of years ago they had that huge upset at Tennessee, and they looked like the team to beat in the tournament with Jared Ivey, and that was the year they actually did have really good guard play. And then they go out inexplicably lose the next round. And then other than that, I feel like they've had all this hype, been a one seed, been a two seed, and they've gone out early. And this one's got to be their most disappointing one of all of these because they were number one for most of the season.
Yes, a colossal disappointment, and especially when you think about FAU making it to the Final Four, the region was going to be probably wide open for them. Marquette also lost in the second round. In the bottom of the bracket, we saw Duke go out early. We saw Kentucky lose pretty early in the second round to Kansas State, and so it was really very wide open for them.
Absolutely. I mean, it was exactly what they wanted for a team that, needed to get a little bit of confidence based on the fact they've had so many issues in March.
Yes, yes, but Fairleigh Dickinson, a phenomenal story. Great to see them get that win, and then their head coach used it for even a bigger job too.
That's right. That was a good launching point for him, and he deserved it. I mean, you talk about like a school. I think I looked it up, has maybe like 3,000 cities and like inner city New York, 3,000 students in inner city New York. I mean, nobody even really knew where Fairleigh Dickinson was.
Yeah, I'd heard of them. I think 3 or 4 years ago they made the NCAA tournament as the 16 seed and lost by like 40 points. That was like all I really knew about them.
Yeah. Um, And speaking of like these high seeds, how about what Princeton was able to do as a 15 seed? They were able to make it to the Sweet 16, and they didn't get embarrassed by Creighton by any means in the Sweet 16 or either. So I thought that was just amazing. The job they were able to do and being a 15 and beating a two, and then coming out and winning in the second round also.
Oh, absolutely. And I think because of the Purdue historic upset, not enough people probably concentrated on Arizona's, upset because Arizona, like they were poised to maybe make a run to the Elite Eight, and a lot of people had them maybe even knocking off Alabama and having a chance to win the national championship with the season that they had. And, they were playing really well coming off similarly, I think a Pac-12 tournament title. And so for them to lose to Princeton, a shocker, and then for Princeton to just dominate Missouri the way they did in the second round, I didn't expect that either.
No, and Princeton beating Arizona. Arizona was a team that the last 2 years they've been among the most athletic teams in college basketball. And I would say that Arizona, I think they're a borderline blue blood. When you think of what Lute Olson did, they won a national championship while he was there. He always had them consistently in the Final Four, conversation. Sean Miller comes there and not without a lot of controversy, but he had some really great teams that got him to the Final Four. And their newest coach they have now is for the last 2 years has had them in the 1-2 line. And so that was a huge upset to me. I couldn't believe that. I know Ivy League teams do tend to sometimes pull off upsets in the NCAA tournament, but to beat a team like Arizona, which is just full of 5 stars, what a shocking upset that was.
Right, and then to be able to come back, Fairleigh Dickinson loses in the next round to FAU. They couldn't get up for that repeat performance, but for Princeton to still come back and dominate Missouri, they just kept coming.
Yeah, that was shocking because Missouri was a team that was playing with a lot of confidence at the end of the year, had a 7 seed. They walked through the first round, and Princeton just handled them in the second round. That was a beatdown.
Mm-hmm, definitely.
So that was good. And I think that Princeton, coach is, with Ivy League jobs, you wonder if people really want to step up because I'm sure they can get paid a decent amount. They're not going to have the same kind of pressure. And if you can get any kind of deal for your kids to go to an Ivy League school, might not be the right move to leave,
Yeah, I think who was it? The Harvard coach, Tommy Amaker, who's been there for forever at Harvard.
Yeah, he made a Sweet 16, and Harvard's had some good runs to the NCAA tournament.
Yeah, for sure.
So that was definitely a cool story. And Princeton too, what I thought was interesting is it wasn't the same kind of thing you think about when you think about Ivy League teams. Generally, you think about them being very defensive. They make a lot of 3-pointers. They don't really, outbig you. But Princeton, they just scored points. That was what they were about. They were fast paced. They didn't really play defense. They just went out there to shoot, and they'd shoot from all over the floor. And they kind of beat you in multiple ways, and they were a fun team to watch.
They really were. They were, a versatile team. They were a fearless team, and they had just a historic, performance for their program.
Absolutely. Joe, and we talked about these teams like Arizona and Purdue going out, but how about an old familiar team that's always a high seed that seems to lose a lot in the NCAA tournament early? And this would be the other one that was a 1 seed that lost the 16 in the past. How about Virginia? And yet again, Tony Bennett having a team go out in the first round and losing to a very low seed, with them being a 4 seed and dropping it to a 13-seeded Furman.
Yeah, with the exception of the national championship run, which again, it's a great, problem to have. Winning the national championship, they've had so many years where they bow out kind of in the first round. It's kind of like the Mike Bianco issue at Ole Miss. Sometimes, unless they win the national title, they're going to go out early. It seems like, and so I think that. At the same time, though, I give a lot of credit to Furman. That was a phenomenal end of that game, how they were able to, steal the ball and hit the last second 3. But, kind of a questionable pass there by Virginia to set that up, too.
Yeah, we were talking about nicknames earlier. We didn't talk about the shooter and Reggie Miller. That was what Virginia did. They did the choke job on that one because I don't think I've ever seen just an ill-advised pass like that. It ended up costing a team a game, especially when they were a favorite.
And the weird thing about that is that I saw this online after the game. I was reminded that the point guard who threw that pass, he threw one of the best passes in NCAA history 4 years ago on that championship team against Purdue. He's the one that threw the pass, I think, from like half court to I don't know, it was about a 40-foot pass that allowed Virginia to make a last-second 2-pointer to send the Elite Eight game against Purdue into overtime. And so 4 years ago, one of the best passes ever in NCAA history. And then unfortunately that happened 2 weeks ago.
It's just like an allegory for life, right? Basketball.
Mm-hmm. Right.
You got your peaks and valleys. Well, Joe, speaking of peaks and valleys, someone else who, not through all of his career, but certainly of late has had a little bit of a Tony Bennett issue would be John Calipari in Kentucky. Yet again, going out in the second round, not making the Sweet 16. I guess at least this year they didn't lose to 15th seeded St. Peter's. But still, I'm sure Kentucky fans are quite upset that they went out in the second round against a Kansas State team who I really love Kansas State. I love Marcus Sowell. I really like Jerome Tang as a coach. But you can talk about feel good stories in Kansas State all day. That's not going to assuage the anger that Kentucky fans have right now.
Yeah, they're really frustrated. They lost to Kansas State a few years ago in the NCAA tournament as well. So I know they, were kind of tired of losing to this team. I think that this was a bracket that we were talking about Arizona having a wide open shot, talking about Purdue having a wide open shot. Kentucky was going to have a great path to the Final Four when you started seeing the upsets on the other side of the bracket. And so I think that they're definitely frustrated. And we see this class of Kentucky seniors that graduates with, I think, one NCAA tournament win.
That is a crazy stat right there. One NCAA tournament win in 4 years, and then John Calipari is sitting there with a lifetime contract.
Yeah, they're not too happy about that.
No, they're not right now. I mean, I wonder how Kentucky fans are feeling overall because, on the football side of it, they've overachieved for so long, but it seems like the last couple of years, they've finally gotten the expectations up in football. They're finally paying Stoops like a lot of money and are trying to keep him around, and he hasn't been meeting expectations. So you kind of feel like if you're a Kentucky fan right now, maybe you're overpaying for both of your big coaches.
Well, the pressure's on next year for Calipari. Luckily for him, I've read that they have their best recruiting class in school history projected to come to Kentucky. So you've got help on the way. But if they don't win next year with that class, and when I mean win, they probably need to make it to a Final Four, take some pressure off. There's going to be a lot more heat.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I mean, you already have people like, holding up signs and like, yelling about how they need to fire him this year during games. And that was when he was able to come back and have a really good end of the year with Oscar Tshiebwe and, a lot of star power. If he doesn't go out and make an Elite Eight or a Final Four next year, I think it's definitely going to be turned up a lot on him.
I mean, what was Calvin Coolidge's nickname? Cool Cal. This is going to be Hot Seat Cal for Calipari.
And you talk about that region. How about the fact that FAU is the one who won that region, is sitting there in the Final Four, and Kentucky goes out in the second round?
Yeah, that is very ironic.
It is. And Joe, before we start talking a little bit of Bama and Auburn basketball, I think I got to say we got to talk about what I thought was the best game in the entire NCAA tournament, and it was one that lived up to all the hype. It's one that you and we identified before the tournament started that this game was going to happen and that we thought it was going to be the best game of the tournament, and it actually did live up to all the hype. And sadly, because I had to have a procedure the next day, I went to sleep early because I saw UCLA winning by 11 at halftime, and I didn't think it was possible that Gonzaga would come back. But how about yet another great, stepping stone in the storied rivalry that's been created in March Madness between UCLA and Gonzaga?
Yeah, it was just a phenomenal game. I just thoroughly enjoyed it, and it was eerily similar to me as it ended the last couple of minutes to the game 17 years ago, because Gonzaga was up by, I think, 8 or 9 points with a minute or two to go, and UCLA, gets the lead at the end. So it looked like it was going to be another situation with Adam Morrison and Gonzaga 17 years ago. But then you see, the amazing shot by Julian Strawther. I still can't believe he pulled up from that deep and shot the three. I think he did that earlier in the year against BYU. So it was kind of a design play that they set up there, but just heroic effort there. Gonzaga hangs on, and how many times do we see a game live up to its hype, and it exceeded that really?
Absolutely. I mean, and how many times, if you're a UCLA fan, can you sit there and just watch Gonzaga rip your heart out with great long distance 3-pointers? I mean, 4 years ago, we were talking about Gonzaga to save their perfect run, get the amazing bank 3-pointer to win. And then they have the great play where, goes the guy inside and then he kind of tosses it behind his head to Julian Strathers and he drills it. I mean, it's almost like, deja vu for UCLA fans.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it really was, and that's not a program that's used to being on that end of the loss.
Absolutely not. I mean, and they were ones who I picked them to win the national championship. I thought there was so much senior leadership on this team with Tyre Campbell and Jaime Jaquez and guys who had been there and been so close, been to a Final Four, lost that game to Gonzaga. Last year, played a real thriller with North Carolina, who ended up going to the national championship but couldn't break through. They ended up winning the Pac-12 this year when the Pac-12 had some good teams, including Arizona State and of course Arizona, the 2 seed. And they go out to Gonzaga, who didn't have their best season.
No, that they didn't. I think this was one of Mark Few's better coaching jobs, just getting them to the Elite Eight, and it was kind of just a Drew Timme driven team because they really didn't have great guard play with the exception of Strother. And I think what hurt UCLA in this matchup was the lack of depth. I really saw them kind of getting tired in the second half. And one of the biggest injuries of the season was Jalen Carter, who's the Pac-12 Defensive Player of the Year. They lost him about 3 weeks ago. I think he was probably really the missing piece from them winning the whole thing.
Absolutely. And I mean, Mick Cronin was kind of talking about it early on in the NCAA tournament and kind of trying to temper expectations, I think, a little bit because he knew how important Jalen Carter was.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And, Joe, speaking of Gonzaga, a couple years ago, one of their unsung heroes, of course, was Andrew Nembhard. Well, this year, his brother doing a great job at Creighton, got them to the Elite Eight. And Joe, I thought that was a really good thing to see them finally make it to the Elite Eight. I would have liked to have seen Creighton make a Final Four because I feel like they're a program that's worthy of achieving a Final Four. I kind of put them in that kind of Providence zone where it's like a small Catholic school that they're always going to be good, but they just haven't quite broken through and gotten that Final Four. And I kind of wanted them to get one so you could throw them in the same, air as a Providence or a St. John's or one of those kind of schools. And they've always been just a little bit short of that, but they got one step closer this year. And I think Greg McDermott is just such a great coach.
Yeah, he's one of my favorite coaches in the sport. Really rooted for him hard when his son, Doug, was there and always hated they couldn't advance further in the tournament. And, I loved a part of that game with it being San Diego State Creighton because I really liked both programs, but also hated it, partly because one of them had to lose. I personally would prefer if Creighton was the fourth team in the Final Four instead of UConn.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is one I was rooting for San Diego State. I've got cousins that are from San Diego. And when I was a kid, that was one of the schools that was kind of on my mind because I loved visiting San Diego so much. I also kind of like their mascot. I think the Aztecs are a really neat mascot and the way they have it presented is cool. And it's one that I kind of like the idea of them doing well because I think they're doing an advertisement for them getting into the Pac-12 now. So I think that, if that hasn't been done yet, I think that might have solidified the fact they're going to be a Pac-12 team within the next year or two.
Yeah, I think I've heard their coach talk about that. I could definitely see that happening.
Yeah. And something interesting to me about San Diego State is you would have thought that they would have made the Final Four when they had Fisher as their head coach, the one who had the Fab Five teams from Michigan that came over to San Diego State and coached there for so long. It's so weird to me that he's not the one that brings them to the Final Four.
Yeah, that is ironic. But interestingly, their head coach now, he was with Fisher for all those runs. I heard an interview with him yesterday where he said, well, personally, this is my fourth appearance of the Final Four because, I was an assistant even going back to the 89 national championship team at Michigan.
How about that? Yeah, so that's where he learned all of his stuff. Well, I mean, definitely keeping it up and keeping that whole San Diego State vibe of just great defense. I mean, what a suffocating defense they've shown with great shot blockers and just a real grinded out style that's very tough to prepare for.
Oh, absolutely. That they are a force.
And Joe, nobody knows that better than the presumptive favorite going in the NCAA tournament, that being the Alabama Crimson Tide. I will have to say that that was one of the most delighted I've ever been watching a basketball game completely unexpectedly because it really looked like, and as friend of the show Hunter was just texting me constantly and calling me about, everything was opening up for Alabama. You looked at UCLA going down, Virginia going down, all Baylor going down in the second round. I mean, it was everybody was losing on that side of the bracket. And it didn't look like there was a single team left there that would even stand a chance against them. And when they take on San Diego State, I think like one pundit maybe had said that San Diego State had a chance, and everybody kind of laughed at them. And they frustrated Brandon Miller, who had kind of a rough tournament. They didn't get the ball into Bediako on the inside, who's 7'2", and I didn't think they really used him the way they should have. And even more impressively, and what I really thought was going to be the difference for Alabama, even against a team like San Diego State, who was so good on defense, they were able to shut down the dribble drive of Javon Quinterly, which I really hadn't seen anybody do that against Alabama all season when they wanted to do that.
Yeah, I mean, they really shut them down. You held them, I think, to 64 points. And just watching, especially the latter part of that game, I mean, San Diego State looked like the power conference team, blocking shots, physical defense. Mensa, was a big inside presence. And coming into the game, I felt like San Diego State was a tough matchup for Alabama because they kind of have a defense that reminds me a lot of when teams have to prepare for West Virginia in the tournament. It's always a grinded out game. I still thought Bama would win. I thought that Bama would probably win, but they would really have to excel and be like, my goodness, that was a tough test. I did not expect San Diego State to win, and they won, and they're definitely taking advantage of their opportunity.
Well, what was even more impressive to me, Joe, is the fact that, San Diego State had a really good first half. They had the lead. They get out to about a 9-point lead in the second half, and Bama goes on this huge run and gets up 10 points on them. And the way San Diego State scored, that kind of seemed like, okay, Alabama's flexing right now. Now San Diego State's done. But they were able to quickly get back in the game, and they were the ones that flexed at the end and really just shut down Alabama and was able to, beat them by 8 points.
Yeah, that they called a crucial timeout. I think that kind of calmed everybody down, and they hit like a couple of good shots. I think it was either Bradley or Trammell that hit like a couple of big jumpers that really kind of settled them down.
Yeah, Trammell had a really good end to that game. And, something else that was interesting to me was I thought Nate Oates made a very poor decision to start fouling too early. Alabama had gotten back into it a little bit at the end. They went on a little bit of a run to get down by 4 points. There was about, I think, 55 seconds left in it. And instead of letting his defense play, which they were doing a good job at the end of the game, he went ahead and fouled San Diego State, and they made both free throws to get up by 6. And I feel like that sequence kind of ended Alabama's chances of winning.
No, that's a good point. I thought about that too. I was like, you're the difference in the score is not really enough to foul this soon. Like, you got enough time to play defense and get a stop. And I thought also that another contributing factor that helped San Diego State was how good they were at getting out of the press. I think it was Matt Bradley at the end of the game pulled off one of the best plays I've ever seen, where somebody being able to get out of like 3 different defenders. He just kind of, cleverly pushed, cleared some space and got out of there when it looked like they had him in for a trap.
Yeah, he kind of did a little spin around, stayed on 1 foot, and then was able to break through just a little opening and was able to get, an extra 10 seconds off the clock. And I think he even got fouled while he was shooting there. And it really was about the perfect sequence you could have to run some clock and get some points.
Because, I mean, how many guys, would just stand there and probably just hold the ball or turn it over? So, I couldn't believe it.
Yeah, that was a really big sequence there. And, Alabama leaves being maybe, at least in the SEC, I would say they're the most accomplished basketball program to never make a Final Four. And now we're sitting there, they still haven't made a Final Four. And neither is Tennessee. And it's kind of shocking seeing both these teams who seem to have brackets that opened up so well for them. Each had a lot of, a lot of preseason hype, and Alabama, a lot of hype during the season. And yet still we sit here and neither one of them's made the Final Four. And even crazier for the SEC, Auburn is the last team from the SEC to make the Final Four. And that's 4 years ago now.
That is true. No, that really is hard to believe. And, similarly, it looked like Tennessee had a wide open opportunity when everybody started losing in their bracket.
Yeah, and I mean, when you saw them having FAU in the Sweet 16, you were like, well, there you go. Tennessee's at least going to make the Elite Eight. and you thought about them taking on a team like Creighton, or not Creighton, they would be, I guess they would have taken on
Kansas State.
in Kansas State. You thought they had a good chance in that one too, because they would obviously have the bigs, their defensive style and physicality would probably be rough for a team like Kansas State. And yet FAU went toe to toe with them, and that was kind of a bad matchup for Tennessee because FAU is one that definitely is a quite a physical team themselves.
That's true. That they are.
And the last thing that I would want to say about the kind of that FAU region, I really loved Kansas State and what they were able to do this year. I mean, I thought Jerome Tang just really showed that the model that Scott Drew created with real nice guy coaches who let their players be themselves. There's no negativity involved. Has a real draw in basketball, can be very successful. And we were talking about Greg McDermott and Creighton earlier. He's also a guy that he doesn't quite come off as nice as Jerome Tang, but when you watch his, the way he interacts with his players, I watched the speech he gave to his players after the loss to FAU, and it almost made me want to cry. It was so beautiful. And Jerome Tang, you watch him and he just kind of gets you inspired. And he just really is someone that's a truly nice person. And I just think it's cool that Scott Drew has kind of put that out there in college basketball. And, we're going away a little bit from the Bobby Knights and the Mike Krzyzewskis to kind of a newer age of definitely much more, player friendly, just likable, nice guys that are doing successful things.
Yeah, Tang, put in a lot of time under the radar as an assistant at Baylor. I want to say he was there maybe as long as 15 to 18 years, where I don't think he left for a long time. And then he takes, this job and is, had a great opportunity there. It looks like he wants to stay right now at Kansas State. And I saw after the game against FAU, he went to the locker room and congratulated the FAU players and told them that he was pulling for them in the Final Four.
Well, it's just a real class act. And I mean, someone that I'm going to look forward to pulling for in the future. And, you got to think that if he is, what he needs to do is do the cautionary tale of Frank Martin. When some SEC school offers him, $7 million a year to be their head coach, that maybe hasn't had a lot of success. Let's say someone like Vanderbilt, let's say that Jerry Stackhouse doesn't work out, and suddenly they offer Jerome Tang a lot of money to leave. Maybe you need to think about Frank Martin, who was doing so many great things at Kansas State. He had his one Final Four run at South Carolina, but other than that, he never did anything. And I bet Frank Martin wishes he had never left the Little Apple.
I still can't believe when you think about it that Martin made it to the Final Four at South Carolina in retrospect.
That was just a crazy run. I mean, it was like a one-off too. I don't know that he ever even went to the NCAA tournament any other year with them.
That was probably the only year.
Yeah. All right, Joe. So let's look at the Final Four matchups real quick. Of course, we have FAU and San Diego State, and then we have UConn and Miami. Let's go to the one first that's probably going to have a little bit of a less draw with, more mid-majors, and that being San Diego State and FAU. Who do you like in this one?
I like San Diego State. I think that their defense and physicality is going to travel well in this game. I talked about Mensah and his presence, referenced Bradley and Trammell. I think that this is a team that dominated the Mountain West during the regular season. And I know that Florida Atlantic had a great season through Conference USA, only 3 losses to their credit so far. I think they're like 35-3 at this time. But when I look at San Diego State, I think they're a little bit more of a well-balanced team. I just think that their defense is going to make it tough for FAU to score. I think that Davis and some of the guards are going to have a tough time getting to the basket. I think you're going to see a lot of kind of empty possessions for FAU where they're kind of stuck on the perimeter, just trying to get inside. And it's just like really hostile and really aggressive for them. And I just look at all the defensive performances that San Diego State has put forth in this tournament so far. 64 points they've allowed to Alabama is the most. They've played a lot of games where their opponents are only scoring in the 50s. And so I say all that to say that I really like San Diego State to make it to their first ever national championship game appearance.
Yeah, Joe, I like the Aztecs in this one too. One thing that really makes me like them against FAU is the way they were able to limit Javon Quinterly when they played Alabama. I think, John L. Davis has a lot of the similar kind of capabilities that Quinterly does with the dribble drive. And if Quinterly couldn't do that against couldn't do that against San Diego State, then there's no way that John L. Davis is going to be able to do that because I think that Quinterly's a better player than him. And FAU does have, they got their 7'1" Russian player that they have, which I always think is like such an awesome thing that you got Golden that came from Russia and he gets to live in Boca Raton, Florida. It must seem like living on planet Mars compared to what he grew up in.
Yeah, definitely a huge contrast there. And don't get me wrong. I mean, FAU has some great players. It's a great story with Dusty May. Like, jokingly, my dad and I were talking about, should Ole Miss have hired him instead of Chris Beard?
That was the other one they talked about, right? I mean,
it almost reached the point where it was going to be the possibility of Texas against FAU for the national championship, which would have been Chris Beard's players against Dusty May. So that would have been really intriguing from an Ole Miss perspective as a subliminal story. But still, though, Dusty May, he has bet on himself and stayed at FAU, and it looks like he's going to be poised to have a big job offer in the next year or two.
absolutely. And, if he doesn't want to, Boca Raton's not a bad place to get to live for a little bit. I think he should, wait and, see if one of those like real blue blood kind of opportunities comes up for him, because I think he's going to be able to do a lot of really good things there. And they're going to be moving to the AAC, which I think will help them, maybe be, if they're not the number one team in their conference, maybe they can get in as like a, might be a year where 2 or 3 teams from that league get in. And so he's set up pretty well, and he's in a great place to recruit to, a nice place to live. And yeah, I was thinking that same thing when I saw this run he has. Like, well, maybe Ole Miss should have thought about him, but I'm still very happy with Chris Beard.
I am too. I think it's going to work out well for both sides.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a good game. But yeah, I really think the defensive prowess that you see with San Diego State with Mensa and the good guard play from Trammell is going to get him over the edge. Joe, on the other side, we have one blue blood in UConn, who I think has been the most consistently dominant team throughout this entire tournament, taking on Jim Larinaga in Miami, who's done some stepping stones the last couple years to get here. You remember last year they beat Auburn, who was the best number 2 seed, beat them really handily in the second round, then made the Elite Eight. And this year he got Wong to return, and he, is just built upon what he did last year, had a better regular season. And Miami is a team that I'm not shocked to see that they made this Final Four. And I think this will be a good game because I think very highly of Jim Larinaga as a coach, but I just think that UConn has shown that they probably should have been maybe more like a 2 seed, and that they're a team that is every bit worthy of when they became the number 1 team in America for a couple weeks during the regular season.
Yes, no, I completely concur with that. And I want to add something, I think, in general about this Final Four. I think when I look at all 4 teams, you're going to hear a lot the next few days about, the lack of maybe true blue bloods in this Final Four, maybe the lack of name recognition of some of the players on these 4 teams. But I think that, following college basketball, I don't think we should necessarily be that shocked that these 4 teams made it. And here's what I mean by that. San Diego State, in their own right, dominated their schedule in the Mountain West.
Mm-hmm.
FAU dominated their schedule in Conference USA. Miami, first place, tied for first in the ACC, just didn't get as much traction because everybody perceived them to be having a down year. They also last year made it to the Elite Eight. They returned Nigel Pack. They returned Isaiah Wong, some of the best guards in the country on this roster with Jim Larinaga. And then you have a UConn team that was ranked number 1 at one point this season. And so to me, it's not really that surprising when you take it all into context. These are 4 really good teams. And so I hope people tune in and give these teams the support I think that they have earned in this incredible tournament run. But ultimately, though, the way it's set up, I don't see a scenario, in my opinion, where UConn doesn't beat Miami. As good as Miami's guard play is, I think they can keep it close for a while. Wong is just, a great shot maker with some of the shots he hit against Texas. But I think Sonogo in the interior presence for Connecticut, I mean, that's just a tough challenge. If guys like Drew Timme are having a tough time inside, I think that Miami definitely will. because it's not just Sonogo. I think Connecticut has at least one other 7-footer that they can kind of rotate in and out. And that's the scary thing about this Connecticut team, Dan. We think about the headliners, Sonogo and Hawkins. They have 2 freshmen that are really good. Like, I think one's a former 4 or 5-star, the other's a former 4-star recruit. These guys will probably be back next year, and UConn, could be once again in the national conversation.
That's right, Joe. I mean, Sonogo, Calcaterra, their guy that can just shoot up threes from everywhere. This is a very scary UConn team and a very deep one. Hurley's done a really great job building this program. And UConn's a team that you're kind of used to seeing here, and I think they're definitely going to be here for years to come because this is a really strong team.
Yes, I mean, to me, it's their championship to lose right now. I'd be relatively surprised if they don't win the whole thing over San Diego State, if that's who they end up playing. And it wouldn't surprise me, if they end up kind of winning the whole thing in somewhat dominant fashion, that kind of personifies their tournament run so far. And you mentioned, Dan Hurley. I give him a lot of credit for taking this job. This is a program that's had a lot of success in the past with Kevin Ollie and, of course, Jim Calhoun. But Hurley has come in, and I would have expected his brother at Arizona State might have had, this kind of impact first. I wouldn't have expected Dan Hurley to be the first one to the Final Four.
Right. You thought Bobby Hurley, who had the great name recognition when he was a player at Duke, was going to be the one who'd take the huge school in Arizona State to the Final Four. But Dan Hurley is really exceeding expectations. And, I mean, from the very first game I watched UConn in the NCAA tournament, they've been dominant from the get-go. And I think I texted you when I watched them the first time. I was like, this team is going to make the Final Four. And I texted my friends that were Alabama fans. I'm like, listen, this is a team that could beat Alabama. I'm watching them. And I kind of thought they were the only one. And they've really kind of gone out there and done that. And Joe, speaking of dominant, Caitlin Clark on the women's side right now, 40 points that she did to beat Haley Van Leith, who's maybe the most unlikable player I've ever seen on the women's side, but kind of exciting for Louisville. Really taking the college basketball by storm on the women's side right now with what Caitlin Clark's doing.
Yeah, I mean, I've really enjoyed watching her play this year. And I told you before the show, this has been, I think, a great season for women's college basketball because we've seen more parity. I know that South Carolina is undefeated. I know that LSU's only got 2 losses, but I feel like more so than most years, it kind of feels like there's not just that dominant UConn or Baylor or Notre Dame. I feel like more teams have a chance to make it to the Final Four.
Absolutely. And, when we come back, we'll talk about a little bit more about women's basketball next when we do a recap, because there's a lot of things we can go through with this women's college basketball tournament. Been a great time talking about the March Madness. You can catch all of those on Spotify. And then, of course, subscribe to our YouTube channel. And as always, I'm Dan.
And I'm Joe.